Hello there, and welcome to Echoes of the Imperium. I'm truly glad you've arrived. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of soul who prefers to drift into sleep with thoughts of distant stars and ancient cosmos.
The moment the fire touched the sky, I knew the galaxy had crossed a threshold it could never return from, because this was not the screaming rupture of the warp nor the obscene bloom of a demonic incursion, but something far older and far more deliberate. A judgment arriving on time after 10,000 years of delay, and I stood there, boots sunk into ash, lungs burning with chemical smoke, watching the heavens peel open like scorched parchment as the impossible descended. The air grew heavy, not with pressure, but with memory, as if every sin ever committed in this sector had condensed into a single breath that the universe was now exhaling. I felt it before I saw it, a presence that did not invade the mind like chaos does, but illuminated it, dragging every buried thought into the open and forcing it to stand naked and accountable. Then the fire came, not red, not war purple, but a bone-white inferno that cast no shadows because it judged all things equally, and from its heart rode a figure that defied every catechism the Imperium had ever carved into my skull. He was death given purpose, wrath given restraint, a skeletal rider wrapped in scorched leather and chains that sang with the weight of 1,000,000 confessions, his skull crowned in flame that did not dance but watched, and beneath him roared a hellish machine that felt less like a vehicle and more like a bound beast, its wheels grinding reality into molten scars as it advanced across the battlefield of Gathalema. The soldiers around men and women who had stood against orc hordes, tyrannid swarms, and demonic tides fell silent, not in fear but in recognition, because something in their souls knew this was not an enemy meant to be killed, it was a verdict meant to be heard. Vox traffic died mid, Auspex screens went black, even the chaplains, those iron-throated keepers of faith, stood mute as the thing passed through our lines without resistance, every step heavy with cosmic finality. When it looked at me, truly looked, I felt my memories ignite every order I had obeyed, every civilian evacuation I had prioritized into oblivion, every prayer whispered not for salvation but for absolution, and I understood then that this creature did not punish intent, only consequence. Behind it, the warp recoiled like a wounded animal. Demonic entities that had been clawing their way into real space screamed and dissolved, not banished but erased, denied even the mercy of damnation, and I felt the terror ripple outward as something unthinkable occurred. The warp itself was afraid. A bloodthirster tore its way through the veil with a roar of hate, only to be seized by chains of living flame and forced to its knees, its rage collapsing into pleading as the rider's gaze burned through it, and with a sound like a dying star, the demon ceased to be, leaving behind nothing, not essence, not echo, not memory. The battlefield fell to its knees then, not in worship, but in instinctive surrender to something that could not be fought, bargained with, or lied to. I watched Space Marines Astartes of ancient lineage clutch their helms and howl as centuries of sanctioned slaughter and righteous genocide flooded back into their minds, their gene-forged certainty cracking beneath the unbearable weight of truth, and some collapsed, armor splitting as if their very bodies rejected the lies they had been built upon. The rider turned his burning gaze toward the stars, toward terror, and I felt a cold realization bloom in my chest. This was not a savior come to cleanse, nor a destroyer come to conquer. This was an auditor of damnation, and the Imperium's books were soaked in blood. When he spoke, his voice did not travel through air but through conscience itself, echoing inside every living thing within 1,000 kilometers. Your empire runs on suffering disguised as duty. You call it survival, I call it debt. The words carved themselves into my mind, and I knew then that there would be no crusade, no final battle, no glorious last stand against this force, because it did not come to wage war, it came to witness, to measure, and to collect. As he turned his flaming skull toward the void, toward terror's distant, decaying light, I felt the future buckle. And for the first time in my life, I understood true fear, not of death, not of chaos, but of justice without mercy, arriving 10,000 years too late and yet precisely on time. And I knew that when the Emperor's gaze finally met this thing of living judgment, the galaxy itself would have to answer for what it had become. The realization did not arrive like a scream or a revelation, but like a pressure behind the eyes, a slow, crushing certainty that settled into the bones of everyone who still lived to witness what followed. Because once the rider turned his gaze toward terror, the galaxy itself seemed to flinch, and I truly felt the vast machinery of the Imperium begin to tremble beneath the weight of something it had never accounted for. The astropaths were the first to die, not in flames or screams, but in silence, their minds collapsing inward as if their souls had been folded too tightly, their last thoughts echoing through the noosphere as fragments of terror and awe before, dissolving into static. And in that moment every long-range choir across the segmentum went dark, not severed by warp interference, but severed by understanding, because whatever this entity was, it did not merely move through reality at intention. I watched as orbital augurs failed, star charts twisted into impossible geometries, and the Astronomicon itself flickered, not dimming, but hesitating, as though the Emperor's ancient beacon had turned its gaze inward in contemplation or doubt. The Ghost Rider did not move quickly. He did not need to. His presence alone bent causality, and the closer he drew to the hive spires of Gathalema Secundus, the more the world seemed to confess. Buildings groaned, not from structural strain, but from accumulated guilt, and the very air carried whispers of every unmarked grave buried beneath the hive's foundations. Citizens collapsed in the streets, clutching their heads as memories they had buried under routine and obedience tore free factory overseers, remembering the children they'd fed to machines. Enforcers, reliving executions carried out in the Emperor's name, nobles choking on the realization that their luxury had been purchased in blood they had never once acknowledged. The rider passed among them like a walking absolution that refused to absolve, his chains drifting outward, not striking but touching, and wherever they brushed flesh, truth ignited. I saw a priest fall screaming as visions of the sermons he had twisted for power burned through him, his faith unraveling not because it was false, but because it had been weaponized. Above us, Imperial Navy vessels attempted to reposition, but their engines stuttered, their machine spirits shrieking in binary terror as if confronted by a command they could not disobey yet could not comprehend. One cruiser fired in desperation, its lance battery lancing down in a beam of sun-hot annihilation, and the beam simply parted around the rider, curving like a bowed head, striking nothing, harming no one, as though reality itself refused to allow the insult. That was when the warp screamed again, not in hunger, but in rage. A rift tore open above the spires, wider than any before, and from it poured the shrieking forms of demons desperate to reclaim relevance, their howls promising slaughter and dominion. Yet the moment they crossed into real space, they faltered, their forms destabilizing, their identities unraveling as the rider turned his burning skull toward them. I saw a Lord of Change unravel into screaming feathers, each one igniting into nothingness. Saw bloodletters fall to their knees, claws digging into the ground as if begging for oblivion. And through it all the rider spoke again, his voice low, almost sorrowful. You feed on corruption, I feed on consequence. The demons did not die, they were undone, erased from memory itself, leaving holes in the warp that closed like scars. And then, impossibly, the rider looked at me again, and I felt the weight of being seen by something that did not hate me, did not love me, but understood me completely. I wanted to beg, to explain that I had only followed orders, that the Imperium left no room for mercy. But the words died in my throat because the truth was simpler and far more damning. I had known better, and I had done it anyway around us. The world was changing, not exploding, not collapsing, but awakening to its own rot. And I understood that this was not an invasion or an apocalypse, but an audit, one written in fire and memory, and that every world, every sector, every golden spire of the Imperium would soon be forced to answer the same question. When the rider finally turned his gaze fully toward the distant glow of terror, the Astronomicon flickered again, and for the briefest moment, I felt something like fear radiate from the heart of mankind's god, not for himself, but for what his empire had become in his name. The rider's engine roared then, a sound like the closing of a cosmic ledger, and as he began to move, I knew with absolute certainty that the age of blind faith was ending, and the age of reckoning had begun. The moment the Astronomicon faltered, even for a heartbeat, terror felt it, and so did I, though I was 1,000 light years away, because some truths echo through the species like genetic memory, and this one struck deep. Something was approaching the throne that had never bowed to it. I felt it first as a pressure behind the eyes, a tightening of the soul, as if every prayer ever uttered in the Imperium had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Across the segmentum, astropaths began screaming in unison, not in pain, but in recognition, their third eyes burning out as they glimpsed a shape, moving along the psychic highways that was not warp-born and not bound by faith or sacrifice. On Terra, the sky over the Imperial Palace darkened, not with storm clouds but with expectation, the kind that settles before judgment is passed, but Custodes felt it before anyone else. Their auramite armor vibrated with unease. Gene-crafted loyalty clashing with something older than their conditioning. Something that whispered that obedience did not erase consequence. Deep beneath the palace, where the Emperor sat entombed upon the golden throne, the machinery of his survival stuttered, not failing, but hesitating, as though even the ancient mechanisms could sense that what approached was not an enemy to be repelled, but a truth to be faced. I was no longer on Gathalama when it happened. I was nowhere and everywhere, dragged along by the psychic wake of the rider as he crossed the void without warp or vessel, his hellfire carving a path through unreality itself. Worlds watched him pass and wept. On shrine planets, pilgrims collapsed in ecstasy and terror as their sins replayed before their eyes. On forge worlds, machine spirits howled as if ashamed. On battlefronts, guns fell silent as soldiers remembered faces they had forgotten on purpose. The rider did not stop, did not slow, because this was not about them, not yet. When he reached Sol, the warp recoiled like a wounded beast. Storms folding inward, demonic presences scattering as if hunted, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium around Terra went quiet. That silence was louder than any war. The Adeptus Custodes formed ranks in the throne room, spears raised, their golden armor blazing beneath cathedral lights, each one a demigod of war who had never known fear. Yet as the temperature dropped and the air filled with the scent of ash and old oaths, even they felt doubt coil in their gene-forged hearts. The doors to the Sanctum Imperialis did not open, they melted. Iron and adamantium running like wax as the rider stepped through, his chains dragging sparks across the marble that had once known the footsteps of saints. He did not look at the Custodes, for their loyalty was not in question. He looked past them, toward the throne, toward the skeletal figure bound to machinery and worship, sustained by sacrifice beyond counting. The Emperor of mankind, corpse god and beacon, stirred not in body, but in present sand for a moment. The galaxy held its breath as two ancient powers regarded one another. I felt it then, the psychic pressure of their exchange. Not words, not images, but truths colliding, the Emperor's grand design, his belief in necessity, his conviction that suffering was the price of survival, and the rider's cold, implacable certainty that necessity did not absolve guilt. The throne flared, golden lights surging, and for a heartbeat I thought the Imperium itself might shatter. But the rider did not raise a weapon. Instead, he extended a burning hand, and within that flame flickered a million moments, the purges, the exterminatus orders, the children fed to the black ships. The faith twisted into chain's end. He let the Emperor see them, not as statistics or sacrifices, but as lives felt, ended, and remembered. The palace shook as if struck by a god's fist, and somewhere deep within the mechanisms sustaining the Emperor, something cracked, not physically, but morally, a fracture in the certainty that had guided humanity for 10 millennia. The rider spoke then, his voice echoing through every shrine and battlefield, every chapel and war zone, every mind that still clung to belief. You built an empire on fear and called it hope. You called your silence mercy. I am not here to end you. The flames dimmed, just slightly. I am here to make you remember, and in that moment, I understood the true horror of what was unfolding, not annihilation, not damnation, but accountability on a cosmic scale. A future where humanity could no longer hide behind gods or monsters or necessity, where every choice would burn its mark into the soul. As the rider turned away from the throne, leaving scorched marble and shaken immortals in his wake, I felt the Imperium's fate tilt, not toward destruction, but toward something far more terrifying, truth. And somewhere deep in the machinery of the Golden Throne, the Emperor wept not in weakness, but in recognition that the age of unquestioned righteousness had ended, and that the galaxy would never again be able to lie to itself in the dark. The first worlds, to feel it, were not the great hive planets or fortress systems, but the quiet ones, the forgotten agri-moons, the pilgrimage outposts, the half-abandoned mining spheres whose names had long since slipped from imperial record, because truth does not strike where power is loudest, but where belief is most fragile. And when the rider turned from Terra and began his passage across the Imperium, the galaxy did not burn, it remembered. I felt it through fractured astropathic echoes, like dreams bleeding through reality, as entire populations woke, screaming from the same vision, not of death, but of themselves, standing alone before a mirror that showed them not who they were, but what they had allowed to happen in their name. On Shrine World, Calaxista pilgrims collapsed mid-prayer as their saints. Statues wept molten gold and whispered the names of the forgotten dead buried beneath their foundations. On Forge World Hacks, The machine spirits howled in binary lament, revealing the centuries of enslaved workers ground into the forges to meet impossible quotas, their pain etched invisibly into every blessed cog. Entire manufacturums shut down, not from sabotage, but from shame, as tech priests tore out their own augmetics in horror at what they had justified as efficiency. The rider never spoke to these worlds directly. His presence alone was enough, a gravity well of truth that pulled lies apart at the seams. Imperial commanders attempted to suppress reports, branding the phenomena heretical hallucinations, but the data would not stay buried. Vox logs replayed themselves, sealed archives opened on their own, and even servitors began to stutter with half-remembered humanity. I watched from a shattered relay station as an entire regiment laid down their arms, not in rebellion, but in mourning, kneeling in the mud as they realized the campaigns they had fought were never about defense. Only delay, only feeding an endless hunger of empire. Above it all, the Inquisition fractured. Some declared the rider an archdemon of unprecedented subtlety. Others whispered the unthinkable, that he was a corrective force, a cosmic consequence long overdue, and as they argued, their black ships drifted powerless, their crews paralyzed by visions of children taken, worlds silenced, and truths edited for convenience. Even the Astartes were not spared. Chapters long thought incorruptible began to splinter as battle brothers confronted memories locked away by hypno-indoctrination, and in those moments of clarity, some wept, some raged, and some chose exile rather than continue a lie. The warp, ever reactive to emotion, twisted under the weight of it all, storms collapsing inward, demonic incursions failing not from resistance but from for despair and rage without ignorance could not sustain them, and through it all the rider moved, an inevitable procession of flame and judgment, never striking, never condemning aloud, simply being a mirror the galaxy could no longer shatter. I felt him again when he passed near my world, the air growing heavy with memory, my lungs tightening as every compromise I had ever made rose before me like a ledger written in fire. I wanted to flee, to beg, to justify myself as a product of survival, but there was nowhere to run from oneself. When his gaze brushed my soul, I understood that he did not demand repentance, only recognition, and that perhaps was the cruelest mercy of all. Around me, cities fell not to invasion but to awakening. Citizens abandoned spires and banners, walking into the wastelands with nothing but the truth in their hearts, while others clung tighter to dogma, forming militant cult states that worshipped denial itself. The Imperium did not collapse, it fractured along moral fault lines that had always been there, now illuminated by fire. In the void, fleets hesitated, commanders paralyzed by doubt, as supply lines failed and borders became meaningless concepts in a galaxy forced to look at itself without the comforting lie of necessity. And still the rider moved on, his path carving a silent question through the stars. What are you, when you can no longer pretend you had no choice? By the time word reached me that the Golden Throne had dimmed again, not in failure, but in quiet contemplation, I understood that this was no apocalypse, number war to be won or lost, but a reckoning without end, and that the Imperium's greatest enemy had never been chaos, xenos or heresy, but the stories it told itself to survive. As the fires of judgment burned on the horizon of every world, I realized with a hollow certainty that history would not remember this age as the time mankind was destroyed, but as the moment it was finally forced to see itself clearly end. That was a terror no weapon could ever hope to defeat. The end did not come with fire or screams, or the triumphant collapse of empires, but with a silence so deep it felt heavier than any bombardment the Imperium had ever unleashed. And in that silence I understood that this was not the conclusion of a war, but the unveiling of a truth humanity had fled from since it first learned to pray. The Ghost Rider stood at the edge of the galaxy now, where the light of the Astronomicon thinned into nothing, where the stars themselves seemed hesitant to shine, and I felt his presence not as a weight but as an invitation, an unbearable one, to witness what came after judgment. Behind him, the Imperium reeled, not shattered but hollowed, its institutions still standing yet emptied of certainty, its banners fluttering over cities that no longer knew what they represented. The Emperor remained upon his throne, alive yet altered, no longer a distant god of unquestioned purpose, but a silent, wounded consciousness forced to remember every sacrifice made in his name, and that remembrance echoed outward, reshaping the soul of mankind. Across the galaxy, wars slowed not because peace had come, but because conviction had failed. Generals hesitated, priests faltered mid-scream, and entire crusades stalled as soldiers asked questions they had never been allowed to form. Chaos did not triumph in this vacuum, far from it, for without blind hatred and ignorance to feed upon, the warp grew thin and brittle, its gods starving as mortals began, for the first time, to understand the cost of their rage. Even the Tyranids recoiled at the edges of the galaxy, their hive minds disturbed by a flavor of resistance that was not violence but awareness, something they could not consume. I saw worlds choose annihilation rather than complicity, scuttling their own hive cities to spare future generations from inherited guilt, while others rebuilt with trembling hands, trying to forge cultures that did not require mass graves to function. Through it all, the rider remained unchanged, an eternal witness riding the borders of reality. His chains now quiet, his fire subdued but undiminished, because his work was never about destruction, it was about remembrance. When at last he turned inward, toward the long road beyond the galaxy, I felt the question he left behind settle into every thinking mind. What will you become now that you can no longer lie to yourselves? There was no answer, only possibility, and that was more frightening than any apocalypse. I understood then that he would not return unless summoned by the same conditions that birthed him: willful blindness, sanctified cruelty, the slow rot of conscience, and that his absence would be the true test. In the quiet that followed, humanity stood alone, without excuses, without divine mandates, without the comfort of inevitable damnation to absolve its sins. The stars did not dim, they waited, and somewhere beyond the edge of existence, the rider watched, not as a god or executioner, but as a reminder etched into the fabric of reality itself, that justice does not need worship, that truth does not need conquest, and that the greatest horror is not judgment from without, but the moment one finally understands oneself and realizes there is no one left to blame. In that understanding, the galaxy did not end, it began again, trembling, uncertain, and finally awake. The moment the fire touched the sky, I knew the galaxy had crossed a threshold it could never return from, because this was not the screaming rupture of the warp, nor the obscene bloom of a demonic incursion, but something far older and far more deliberate, a judgment arriving on time after 10,000 years of delay. And I stood there, boots sunk into ash, lungs burning with chemical smoke, watching the heavens peel open like scorched parchment as the impossible descended. The air grew heavy, not with pressure, but with memory, as if every sin ever committed in this sector had condensed into a single breath that the universe was now exhaling. I felt it before I saw it, a presence that did not invade the mind like chaos does, but illuminated it, dragging every buried thought into the open, and forcing it to stand naked and accountable. Then the fire came, not red, not warper, but a bone-white inferno that cast no shadows because it judged all things equally, and from its heart rode a figure that defied every catechism the Imperium had ever carved into my skull. He was death given purpose, wrath given restraint, a skeletal rider wrapped in scorched leather and chains that sang with the weight of 1,000,000 confessions, his skull crowned in flame that did not dance but watched, and beneath him roared a hellish machine that felt less like a vehicle and more like a bound beast, its wheels grinding reality into molten scars as it advanced across the battlefield of Gathalimus. The soldiers around men and women who had stood against orc hordes, Tyranid swarms, and demonic tides fell silent, not in fear but in recognition, because something in their souls knew this was not an enemy meant to be killed. It was a verdict meant to be heard. Vox traffic died mid. Allspec's screens went black. Even the chaplains, those iron-throated keepers of faith, stood mute as the thing passed through our lines without resistance, every step heavy with cosmic finality. When it looked at me, truly looked, I felt my memories ignite every order I had obeyed, every civilian evacuation I had prioritized into oblivion, every prayer whispered not for salvation but for absolution damned. I understood then that this creature did not punish intent, only consequence. Behind it, the warp recoiled like a wounded animal. Demonic entities that had been clawing their way into real space screamed and dissolved, not banished but erased, denied even the mercy of damnation, and I felt the terror ripple outward as something unthinkable occurred. The warp itself was afraid. A bloodthirster tore its way through the veil with a roar of hate, only to be seized by chains of living flame and forced to its knees, its rage collapsing into pleading as the rider's gaze burned through it, and with a sound like a dying star, the demon ceased to be, leaving behind nothing, not essence, not echo, not memory. The battlefield fell to its knees, then not in worship, but in instinctive surrender to something that could not be fought, bargained with, or lied to. I watched Space Marines Astartes of ancient lineage clutch their helms and howl as centuries of sanctioned slaughter and righteous genocide flooded back into their minds. their gene-forged certainty cracking beneath the unbearable weight of truth, and some collapsed, armor splitting as if their very bodies rejected the lies they had been built upon. The rider turned his burning gaze toward the stars, toward Terra, and I felt a cold realization bloom in my chest. This was not a savior come to cleanse, nor a destroyer come to conquer. This was an auditor of damnation, and the Imperium's books were soaked in blood. When he spoke, his voice did not travel through air but through conscience itself, echoing inside every living thing within 1,000 kilometers. Your empire runs on suffering disguised as duty. You call it survival, I call it debt. The words carved themselves into my mind, and I knew then that there would be no crusade, no final battle, no glorious last stand against this force, because it did not come to wage where it came to witness, to measure, and to collect. As he turned his flaming skull toward the void, toward Terra's distant, decaying light, I felt the future buckle, and for the first time in my life, I understood true fear, not of death, not of chaos, but of justice without mercy. Arriving 10,000 years too late, and yet precisely on time, and I knew that when the Emperor's gaze finally met this thing of living judgment, the galaxy itself would have to answer for what it had become.